The music today was an English country dance called Trip to Paris, written in 1711. So we're roughly at the period we're going to be talking about. We'll be talking about some suspicious fires and a riot in 1711 and 1712 later today. This particular song was first published in something called New Country, the New Country Dancing Master, the second edition by Walsh in 1711. The lecture today is on the origins of Homeland Security. We deal with two events that are only 6 years apart. The trial of a newspaper editor that many of you probably have heard about, John Peter Zenger. The Zenger affair, it's often called. Zenger is Z-E-N-G-E-R in 1735. And that story is known to every schoolgirl and schoolboy as a foundational story of the American origins of freedom of the press. So we'll talk about that kind of narrative that's been passed on as part of a foundational story of New York City's history. That story is one that's often told about factionalism, something we talked about last time, that characterized not just New York City, but was really seen as fundamental to the construction of the American Constitution. In particular, the debates surrounding the Federalist Papers, we'll talk about a bit later. The second event, 6 years later, is 1741, tells a very different story than freedom of the press. It's commonly referred to as the Negro Riot of 1741. And we need to think about why it has been, in fact, little known until a decade or so ago. Why was it called, or has it been called, the Negro Riot? And how does it, that's to say, why shouldn't it be called something else? And how does it decenter, Gesundheit, the story of factionalism of the Zenger story, giving a class dimension rather than interest group dimension to what is otherwise seen as an era in which the defining conflict is simply between competing elites rather than between two very different social groups. African American slaves and the landed property classes. Before I proceed, this is fragment 5 from game 1, the Chelsea game. It is simply a fragment, top of a building, Chelsea, that says the corner, Coster, and Bial. B-I-A-L. I will post this picture and the last picture from last Monday, as well as the picture for next Monday, up on the blackboard either later today or tomorrow. So for those of you who want to go off in the snow this weekend, are welcome to do so. Okay, we begin. The irony is that resources in land, which New York had a good deal, and in commercial wealth, which New York also pioneered, were in fact counterproductive in the ways in which, rather than advancing progress, they also deeply divided the city, and divided the city from those outside its boundaries. It was also the source, in other words, not simply of progress and unity, but of profound division, which historians have called factions. The roots of factionalism, we mentioned last time, lay in New York's emergence as an Atlantic world commercial port. Okay? A port that reached outwards, not backwards simply into the hinterland at this moment in time. In the 19th century, it'll move backward as well into the West. At this moment in time, it is looking outward toward the Caribbean and toward Europe. The Atlantic world, where we are the center of a commercial entrepot, commercial nucleus of enterprise. And in order to advance that, the strengthened role required that New Yorkers build an infrastructure, political, economic, social, to advance that project. That meant deepened harbors, but it also meant secure defenses on the borders and at sea. In truth, you should know that New York's growth was still second to that of Boston and Philadelphia. New York does not become the major city in the New World until the end of the century. We'll get there in another week. But we're still in the first half of the century. So we're still languishing behind them, but we're going to obviously leapfrog because of developments during this century, meaning the 18th century. Okay? In order to do that, commercial elites, property elites, landowners, needed to find markets for their goods, flour, sugar, and promote entrepreneurship, and particularly in the context of land people, but also people on the high seas, provide a secure environment for that development. That could mean western boundaries, but it could also mean thinking about protection on the high seas as well, from pirates, from other countries. The question was how to do it, and how to get the money to do it, how to raise the revenue. And it comes to a head in the opening decade of the 18th century, by the end of that century, 1710 in particular, as a vexing problem. And it would be a problem, as I've already tried to suggest, that would animate our founding fathers later in the Federalist Papers, who debated whether we ought to have a small republic or a large republic, whether it should be divided into small units and large units, and they warned that the one thing that our organization of government had to avoid were the problems of factions. That's to say, the ability of just 2 or 3 people to unite as a small cabal and tyrannize everybody else. And the answer that the Founding Fathers came from and advanced in the Federalist Papers was to have a large central government in which no small group of people would be able to dominate, but rather every interest group would be divided. There would be many different interests, and they would have to become homogenized. Think of it as a group of people that want to insist that we only eat chicken, and you're going to insist we're only going to eat fish, and you're the vegetarians, and somebody else is advancing only pork. Not sure why, but so be it. The question is that any small group, if the group is, say, a small society of only 3 people, 2 can gang up against 1. If it's a society of 2,000 people, in order to get a majority, you've got to get 1,001 people on your side. And to do that, it means that the fish people may have to compromise with the chicken people and the pork people to outvote the vegetarians, who may then decide, well, they're going to make advances to lactose intolerant people and try to get the milk lobby on their side. I'm running out of opportunities here, but you get the idea. Okay? And what you end up with, in fact, is a government, I would argue, that becomes kind of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. 2 parties that are really fighting over the center, over the middle, because that's where the difference in where you get the 1,001th vote on either side. This was all animated by a concern about faction, by which they meant any one group of people holding one kind of interest dominating others. It could be a propertied interest, it could be a non-propertied interest. It could be property in commerce, it could be property in land. And they were trying to make sure none would dominate everything else. So that is something that has its origins in the early 18th century, but would shape the nature of the government in the United States. What were the 2 choices in terms of revenue? Indirect taxes and direct taxes. The indirect tax was to be on trade. Duties on rum, wines. Internal excise taxes on liquor. Basically, you know them as sales taxes. Okay. We would tax European imports. We would tax the import of slaves. We would tax goods involved in the Indian trade, like furs. Who would, of course, oppose that? The merchants, because they're the ones being taxed. The alternative would be direct taxes on property, property taxes. They would be collected as needed for defense against Indians, and it was to be based primarily on personal and improved real property, in particular, all those patents. Remember the oblong patent, the patroonships. The people who were going to be most opposed to that, of course, were going to be landowners, landholders.
So by real property, it's confined just to land?
Well, initially, that's right. That was the main part that was going to be taxed. Later, that would become all kinds of property. Obviously, we end up talking about what would be the equivalent of income tax versus sales tax. Okay? Between 1691 and 1715, £4,000 was raised by indirect taxes, and £2,700 was raised by direct taxes. So you can see during the earlier period, they're basically playing one off against the other and trying a little bit of both. And indeed, if you think about our own government, that's what they do. It's trying to make everybody unhappy, okay, a little bit. Everybody share the burden in this case. The problem was not in simply deciding who to tax. As I've indicated to you earlier, it was also a problem of collecting the tax. It was one thing to pass taxes, it's something else to make sure you all file, that you all acknowledge all the income that you have. Remember all that kind of hidden income under the table that people taught we all know about that exists. The nanny problem, the people who are doing housework. How many of you do babysitting and declare your taxes from babysitting income? Don't all raise your hands at once. Okay? Well, you get the idea. So the problem was collecting these taxes, especially and particularly indirect taxes. Those were the more difficult to collect. The land was visible. Okay? The stuff that you put under the table is less visible. Money that you pay to one another. Merchants could avoid duties by simply declaring imports and exports, by not declaring imports and exports, basically just not declaring the income that you've made. So there is constantly a shortage of revenue, and it's exacerbated by the public knowledge, the not-so-secret secret that people are not acknowledging and paying their taxes. Okay? The governor, therefore, constantly makes renewed efforts to tighten collecting. And of course, that simply irritates the merchants in particular. So he reverses tact and tries to increase taxes on landowners or on property, which of course irritates the landowners. The answer increasingly was to simply make money, to have the central government start producing their own money. And we've seen that from time to time as well as an answer to government for some of this. And paper money becomes an increasing source of revenue for the government to provide security, development projects, etc. in the city. The Assembly passes bills in 1717, 1718, in lieu of collecting some of these taxes. The merchants often oppose, but the landed gentry have the upper hand, and by and large, that's what happens. After 1725, the merchants gain power, and they have the support of the governor. So increasingly, they want taxes now placed on land. Historians, on the whole, argue about this period that while all these divisions were rather deep, fundamental to them was, in fact, the struggle for political power. These were not people who were opposed to each other's wealth. These are people who wanted all of their wealth to be protected. They all believed in private property and the protection of property, the protection of wealth. They believed it was duly earned and should be protected, whether it came from slaves, whether it came from indentured service, whether it came from taking land from Indians. They believed it was all deserved and not to be questioned. Okay? And they supported one another in that. So they weren't contesting that amongst one another. The real issue was having political power from time to time to be able to cement their authority around a whole range of issues, including taxation. Political alignments are as much about regional interests, that's to say whether you're upstate or downstate, as they are simply about economic interests. Okay? They are overlapping sets of concerns, because we know basically upstate is where a lot of the landed interests were. Downstate is where the merchants predominated, but there were merchants upstate. The fur merchants, the furriers were all upstate, so it wasn't a clear division. The upstate versus New York City emerges, however, as a central node of disagreement that will undermine the ability of New York society to develop itself politically and socially. Long Island, for instance, increasingly finds itself more aligned with Albany than with New York City, because the merchants are in New York City and the landowners outside the city in the hinterland have more in common both to our east with those to our north. Albany increasingly becomes an independent Hudson Valley food processing center. They're not simply producing furs. It becomes a competitor for New York City, and that's going to shape, by the way, New York City's political but social history as well, whether it's a matter of getting money for infrastructure projects, whether it's going to be agreeing to pass taxes for social welfare. All of those kinds of issues are shaped by this kind of political division. By the 1730s, New York City had begun to emerge as a major seaport mercantile concern. Growth begins to accelerate in the second and third quarters of the century, as I've suggested earlier, with all this intercolonial trade, meaning the trade between New York and Boston and New York in the South, and trade with the empire, the Atlantic world. All of this reinforced the need for a strong central government. Okay? And New York merchants believe they need a strong central government. They need a central government, among other things, that can protect the currency. They need a central government, they believe, that can protect the ships on the high seas. And they believe they need political connections to London with New York. All of these concerns, however, are put slightly on a back burner by events that erupt in the early 1730s over political power. And they begin with the arrival of a new governor in 1732 by the name of Cosby, Governor Cosby, C-O-S-B-Y. His arrival sets off events that characterized 18th century factionalism, but it also created and shaped a clear window for us into the social and political institutions that would shape New York City's history, in particular a new institution, the Fourth Estate, meaning journalism or an independent press, as a critical vehicle for faction, for fighting. Cosby, when he arrives, irritates the colonists no end. They were more than aware that he was chosen not because of his skill as an administrator, but simply because his wife was the first cousin of the Duke of Newcastle. It was a pure piece of payoff, for a family payoff for the royalty. He irritated people then by what he proceeded to do. He arrived, and he became friends of one side in some of the disputes, in particular the Delanceys and the Phillipses, two of the families we talked about last time. It's presumed that he does so possibly because the Assembly complied with his request that they give him £1,000 for work that he had done, he claimed, on the Assembly's behalf while still in London. So the first thing he does is he comes here and he says, "You owe me £1,000 for work that I did." It's graft, plain and simple. Cosby then asks Rip Van Dam, the Van Dam family. Van Dam was the acting governor. And he asked Van Dam for half of Van Dam's salary for the past 13 months, arguing that he had been doing Van Dam's work while in London. Van Dam was not pleased. Van Dam, however, was the governor of New York. The governor of New Jersey was Morris, William Morris. Remember Morrisania? We talked about this. He had reason to believe that if Cosby was going to ask Van Dam for half his salary, Cosby was soon going to be asking Morris for half of his salary. He was correct. Morris, however, also led what we refer to as the landed interest. Remember Morrisania, that group of land. He was the person who was most advancing the faction invested in landed property and advancing the cause of landed property. He had expected Cosby would side with them and with their claims to additional lands in Westchester County. But Cosby instead supported a rival set of claimants. A trial was held over this claim, these rival claims. Two of the justices are James Delancey and Frederick Phillips. Remember, I noted earlier that Cosby had an alliance with Delancey and Phillips. And they side with Cosby against Chief Justice Morris, 2-1. So Morris loses his case to get the land that he wants, and instead it's going to be given to Cosby's friends, obviously in exchange for them aligning with Cosby in his claims for, among other things, Morris's salary. Morris censors both of his younger justices and refuses to allow the case to go forward, arguing that this should only be handled by the legislature. It shouldn't be handled. He tries to, in other words, remove the court from hearing the case. You can hear they're each talking about looking for sources of political power. Morris, in this case, was saying, well, if I don't have power in my own court, I'm going to argue it belongs in the legislature. Cosby's feeling, well, he's got the power in the courts because he's got 2-1 votes. He wants it there. So the struggle becomes over who has power and where power will be held in order to gain political advantage. Cosby, of course, is furious, and he writes the Duke of Newcastle that Morris is a madman and should be dismissed as Chief Justice. The Duke of Newcastle, you may recall, was his friend, so his act is as a friend, and he fires Morris. Morris decides to wage a public war, to appeal to a different court, the court of public opinion. This is a whole new sphere of social and cultural life in the city. The whole idea, in fact, that rather than simply referring to one's friends, that one ought to appeal to a broader public. The problem was, how do you reach the public? And who is in the public? Are you in the public? I'm not sure. You're a woman. Nah. Are you in the public? You look a little too dark-skinned. Not you. So it's partially about who we're appealing to, right? So it's a small, still relative group, but it's a larger group than just the justices. The source of public opinion is the newspaper. At the time, however, there was only one newspaper in New York called the New York Gazette, and it was the official printer and government publisher. So it was controlled by Cosby. It also generally limited itself, as most of these papers did at that time, the one paper in town, to simply being a mouthpiece for government. It told you what the government wanted you to hear, and it also told you when the ships were coming and going, so that people could go on with the business of commerce. So the problem was to create an alternative voice. Morris and his allies, people who he hoped were going to gain the land in the north, hire a man named John Peter Zenger, Z-E-N-G-E-R, Zenger, to start a rival paper called the New York Weekly Journal. The Weekly Journal. Zenger's paper is very different in both its content and form. It isn't simply a government documents. It isn't simply a list of when ships are coming and going. He actually puts in articles of opinion, articles of news. He has essays written. He hires people who have opinions, who write views about life in the city. And if those views excite opposition, they're called polemics. One person's news is another person's polemic. One person's television station is described as news, for somebody else it's entertainment. Okay? Pick your station. The point here is that it was a very different kind of paper, and it was an alternative voice. Cosby was ruthlessly attacked in it. And so he sues Zenger for libel. A very interesting notion. The Zenger case is narrowly about libel and freedom of the press. It is actually also about the broader context of the political economy as it's emerging in 18th century New York. The case coincides, for instance, with a serious economic depression. You're pretty safe, by the way, to just presume if it's the 30s, in a decade, we have a depression. So let that be a warning to you. Both elite factions sought popular support as a consequence from people, all of whom were very anxious about jobs. They were anxious about whether their business was going to continue. They were anxious about whether any of them could afford to pay taxes, whether it was for excise, property, or maybe health benefits. I don't think they worried about that then. There was a municipal election in 1734 that then coincides with this libel case. The Morrisites promise everybody a new almshouse and a poorhouse. Okay? They, that's to say, start promising everyone who's feeling vulnerable health care. It's a version of it. Social welfare. Poor relief. They're saying we won't allow the poorest among you to be destitute without having a place to turn to. Well, people, gee, I could support that. Not so bad if you're poor, if you're feeling vulnerable. But I'm willing to listen. Well, what's Cosby got to offer me? I'm hearing what Morris has got to offer me. Well, the Morrisites went beyond that. They said, well, we'll also promise you £12,000 for fortifications that we'll spend, construction jobs, and we'll extend the franchise. We'll allow more people to vote. Well, not you and not you, but we'll allow people to vote maybe who aren't millionaires. You can just be somebody who's an artisan and owns your own house and makes £50 a year. Remember, there were always those gradations about who votes. So they extend the franchise and bring in a few more folks who say, gee, giving me citizenship. And other people say, well, you know, they're getting closer to how much I make. I could begin to support this position. And indeed, Whig ideology at the time was one of deference, and it remains so. So that for most people, there still was a lot of respect for, deference really combines respect and fear. Okay? That's what awe often is. It's a combination of the two. You both respect people and you're a little fearful about the power that they have, and it combines those two elements. And that's what deference politics were about. So elites advanced the common good with the understanding that the common good would be determined by them and they would direct it. So they would determine whether, they would advance that there would be a poorhouse, but they would decide whether you're allowed in and whether you're truly poor. That's to say whether you're the deserving poor or whether you are the undeserving poor. A fundamental category we'll talk about. And I'll decide whether you're really poor or whether you're really just lazy. And lazy people we don't want to give welfare to. We send them to jail. But industrious people who have failed because they even though they're industrious, those get in. And I'll decide that because it's my money and because I'm well educated and because I know what's in your best interests. It's called a grade. I hope you see that there are there are levels on which this does operate. I actually do have a degree, and there are ways in which I am supposed to know some of these things, and there are ways in which it can also become authoritarian. It plays all those different kinds of pieces at the same time. Okay? So there was a base in some of the things that they were saying. The artisans looked at all these offers, and on the whole, we know they had few illusions about them. They understood that elites wore masks, but they also respected that they had authority and power. And this was a moment really of transition in thinking about whether artisans and others could take on that authority themselves. The 1735 Libel Trial proceeds right after this election. And ordinary New Yorkers are won over by Zenger. And Zenger wins the trial. Behalf of Morris's. The result, of course, is that New York would never become a one-newspaper town again. And the presses would flow with political commentary. It also should be noted that the presses would flow with political commentary that would be every bit as licentious and libelous as they might have been in the case involving Cosby earlier. What, though, of freedom of speech? Well, the case won it, but it won it in the abstract as an abstract principle. It did not win it for most people, and most people understood that. Okay? It won it for a very small fraction, but it opened a door. It opened a door, that's all. Especially if you were a citizen. That door was not open if you were a slave. It was not open if you were a woman. It was not open if you were an indentured servant. And of course, it was not open if you were below age. And it often was not open if you were of the wrong religion. They didn't worry about Muslims. At that point, you simply were Jews and Catholics on the whole. Freedom focused on speech. On speech. And on enterprise, it was freedom of enterprise if you were a merchant or a landowner. If you were a working class person, there were a different set of rules. An example were the cartmen of New York. The cartmen were people who carried things in carts and provided major services. They are the origins of two major occupations that you know in New York City today. What would they be? Anyone want to harbor a guess?
Garbage men.
Garbage persons, sanitation engineers we call them. I think they're pretty much mostly men, but sanitation engineers. Anyone have an idea who the other major occupational group would be? The cartmen? Cabbies, taxi cab drivers. You can carry goods or you can carry people. So the origins of both of them, and think of them, they are both licensed groups and public employees. And the cartmen have their origins as a licensed group from the 17th century in England, as a group of working people providing a service that was a public service. They were, in fact, not given autonomy. They were regulated by the state, even as the state insisted nobody else that they shouldn't be regulated. That's to say, the landowners, the entrepreneurs say we should have freedom of enterprise, but the cartmen should not, because they are a public service. They should be regulated. You will find that kind of duplicity through our history about public sector. How did it play itself out? The cartmen asked for a wage increase. To get permission for the wage increase, they had to ask the government run by the elites, which turned them down. It turned them down on a very fundamental principle that still operates in the 18th century political economy of the city, and it will be very important because we want to talk about its shift in the 19th century. It is called the moral economy. It comes out of the medieval world. It presumes that there is to be a just price for fundamental goods and services. What is the fundamental good? It is the staff of life, bread. So bread was to be regulated by the state so that it was provided for everybody and the price was affordable. Merchants, bakers were not allowed to increase that price without permission of the state, because the state was to provide a moral economy for those things that were shared by its citizens. The transport of goods was placed into that category for the cartman. Bread prices were put into that category. And you'll see periodically there will be flour riots, bread riots, whenever anyone tries to start increasing those prices, because it was seen to be a fundamental privilege that everyone was supposed to have. That's to say, it presumed a notion of entitlement that remains important in New York City's history, and uniquely so, because New York City, unlike every other city in the 20th century, develops a broader notion of entitlement than probably any other city other than the Socialist Republic of Santa Monica in the United States. Okay. That's to say, it presumes that people ought to have housing and will have rent control in New York City. It presumes that there should be health care and there will be city-run hospitals in New York City. It presumed that there should be education and there was a free university system in New York City. Okay. Those are all notions of entitlement, and different cities and states and governments have different notions. They have their origins in this very simple notion of what should be moral from a state. And in this early period, it was presumed that while everyone else should be free to make money, which was believed to be part of God's infinite variety in Calvinist theology. If you read John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, it begins that some are rich and some are poor, and that's a function of God's infinite variety. Okay? And you don't muck about with God's infinite variety, because God is omniscient, He's omnipresent, He's omni-everything. And He endows everybody with different abilities. Some of you can run fast and some of you can run slow. Some of you are very good at counting out money in the counting house, and some of you are very good at digging ditches. God bless you all. And she does, for those different abilities. It is His infinite variety. And you didn't muck about with it. So at the same time as it presumes inequality is fundamental to America as a moral imperative from the religion, it also presumed there needed to be some bases on which the entire society should have fundamental entitlements. Bread in a cease was one. The cartmen feel the other side of that. It meant they couldn't get a wage increase at the same time as merchants were free to charge as much as they wanted. Furriers could charge as much as they wanted for their goods. So it was a very different standard. Faction, therefore, was sometimes limited, but it was not a fiction. It was real. But it should not obscure much, nonetheless, which made elites and many white folks in the colony agree. There were great divisions, that's to say, in these factions, but there was one thing they all agreed upon, especially in these moments of insecurity, and that was the need for security. That was the overriding concern that animated all of these kinds of actions. Political power shifted intermittently from one interest group to the other, from 1691 into the 1730s. But as the historian Michael Kamen has concluded, quote, security, not factionalism, was the paramount concern of public life. Security, not factionalism, was the paramount concern. Both sets of elites, I will remind you, privileged property. They reinforced the status quo. The concern was to make sure that status quo was protected against others. Internal subversion, external subversion. Internal threats, external threats. Fear came from the French and Indian allies in the countryside. You will know them as the French and Indian Wars in mid-century. 7 acts were passed in the first 2 decades of the century alone. In the New York City Assembly, in support rather of defense against the French and the Native Americans. And they created a militia which fined people if they did not serve. Remember, that had its origins all the way in the 17th century. The currency system was largely begun for the need for money, but that money was primarily to fund a militia. For all the wars, the constant state of war that was going on among England and its European competitors. But remember that the period we're talking about is English history. We are, if you'd like, Little England. Okay? This is English history during this period until 1783, technically, or 1776, if you'd like. In New York City, really, till 1783. Okay? The major fear was the Indians, and New York City history and policy expenditures focused on an anti-Native American set of, built on long-standing anti-Native American attitudes, based on the notion that we first and foremost acquired their land. We bought them. We paid a just price for it. That's the story. But it was an abiding story all of us have heard since we were kids. It was believed. And it justified the fact that we invaded their land. We didn't. We simply occupied it, and we deserved it because we were Christian, and we did it and used it in ways they weren't. It was self-justification. And then we resented it when they didn't agree with us, when they didn't seem to acknowledge our laws, which we celebrate as a legal system, not recognizing that cultures have their own implicit legal systems. Finally, fear shaped how all others were understood by elites. And those others could be the undeserving poor. They could be uppity people making claims that seemed to threaten what people expect, how people were supposed to abide by their status in society. It could be seen as somebody who seemed to look the wrong way. Somebody who seemed to, if we were back in 1691 in Salem, Massachusetts, somebody who seemed to make John Proctor get a little hot and bothered because he thought was coming on to him, and this was making him anxious because as a good Puritan, he shouldn't have those kinds of feelings. And so she clearly was a witch, or he wouldn't feel that way, because no self-respecting person would feel that way. So fear was animated by others, and was animated by all of these changes in social relations. The internal threat was equally compelling to the external threat. And it was raised by the specter, as I've suggested, of poor people, unruly workers, and disgruntled black slaves. Now, race, as we know, in particular, has a long and tragic place in the story of New York City. Periodically, it will erupt in ways that are not much fun. It's a story, as we've heard, with roots in the 17th century. But it's dramatized most graphically by events in the first half of the 18th century that we'll talk about today. I'll talk about the treatment of the poor next time, though we'll see hints of that treatment and repeated concerns about unruly workers that animated a racial narrative about African Americans. The most dramatic anxieties, with the most dramatic ramifications, were raised by fears of slave insurrections. New York City passed its first comprehensive slave code in 1703. To say in 1703. Now you remember that we talked about half freedoms for slaves in the 1640s, and we mentioned how quickly that wasn't extended onward to second generations. And indeed, by the last half of the 17th century, rather than thinking about incorporating blacks, they're increasingly concerned now about disciplining, regimenting, governing slaves. The slave codes are an effort to do just that. Slavery would henceforth, from 1703 forward, be legally associated with black skin. Okay? Not just indentured servitude. It was to be distinguished. There were lots of other people in servitude. Okay? That was called the fate of women in a patriarchal society. But beyond that, it had to do with domestic, and you think of it as domestic service, the term domestic service, but also in servitude, indentured service. Distinguished from each of those is now black skin as slavery. Okay. The enslavement of Indians by the code was in fact forbidden. You could not enslave Indians. They were too noble, even though they were savages. They were both. So it just marks out the history of New York, blacks, differently. Indentured servitude was allowable, but only to white people. Black people could not become indentured servants. And masters were given virtually unlimited authority over slaves in New York City. And to enforce that, New York City establishes, at this time, a common whipper, capital C, capital W, the common whipper for the city. We all know the names of all the mayors. We don't keep track of all the names of the common whippers. Those are whippersnappers, I think, eh? Despite this regulation, the laws were difficult to enforce. Slaves congregated. Some brawled, some fought, some walked the streets at will, and they drank liquor like everybody else. There were also runaway slaves from other colonies who came and sought refuge in New York. So it sometimes was difficult to know whether this black person was free and that black person was a slave. It could get even more complicated if a black person was the child of a white parent. How black is black? Think of your story of Thomas Jefferson later, right? So we'll come back to that complication. They thought they knew blackness nonetheless. I've often had a class where I've asked everybody to describe the social profile in the class, how many people they think are black and how many are white, and I never get the same number. Okay? Because a lot of people have notions of their own identity, but your identity is not simply determined by you, it's determined by how other people see you. In the first half of the 19th century, remember, 20th century, Italians, Jews, Mediterraneans were thought to be swarthy and were often described in the media and by Protestant elites as, quote, not quite white folk. So the notion of who was white changes over time in all of this, and that muddies this kind of the actual practice of these policies. Okay? Restiveness about slaves often threw whites into a panic. And there was good reason. Half a dozen slave insurrections and revolts were occurring up and down through all the colonies. And there were stories about murder by slaves from Barbados, from Antigua, from Jamaica, and those stories all came back to New York because of the trade. Remember, we were on the major communication line with our ships from those areas. In 1690, a gang of runaways allegedly robbed and terrorized Dutch farmers in Harlem. So there were precedents And those precedents were remembered by people. They weren't remembered as, they weren't necessarily all facts, but they were remembered as facts. We don't always know what actually happened. And in some cases, by the next generation, we don't have to know what happened so much as we have to know that people acted as if it happened. Okay? They believed it happened and acted accordingly. That mattered. The fear was real. Excuse me. In 1706, Governor Cornbury. Oh, he's an interesting governor. He's the cross-dressing governor of New York. Another story, but go look for their pictures of him as a cross-dresser. He bans any Negroes, they were called then, from, quote, assembling in a riotous manner in any part of Kings County, Brooklyn, and orders that they be shot if they didn't disband. Again, remember, it was left up to the authorities to determine what constituted a riotous manner. Was that drinking loudly in a bar? Was that walking the streets and singing? Was that doing a jig? What constituted a riotous manner? Like questions about the disorderly, the unrespectable poor were being left into the hands of thems of us who can figure those things out and act fairly. We know. I know when you're rioting. So don't tell me that you're not. And so it went. So these acts can be quite pernicious, potentially. The worst white fears were realized, however, in 1711, 1712, when 24 slaves, angry for the harsh treatment by their masters, sought revenge and killed 9 whites. Now remember, you're talking about slaves killing their masters. Now you can decide that that's violence. You can also decide that what would that be like if you put yourself in the position maybe of people in an internment camp, like in Auschwitz, and if they attack the SS guards, would you want to call that murder? So again, remember, we're talking about a society of slavitude. All I'm trying to do is to muddy it for you a little bit in understanding this stuff. Okay? But from the perspective of people of authority, we understand how that was understood. I'm just trying to get you inside the black slaves' heads a little bit. Okay? A little bit, this story. But from the perspective of whites, this was terrifying. Governor Hunter acted as his name suggested. He hunted them down. 6 escaped his vengeance by cutting their own throats. 70 others were arrested and tried. 20 were hung. 3 were burned to death. 1, Tom, a slave of Nicholas Roosevelt, there's a nice New York family, was roasted over a slow pit for 8 to 12 hours as a lesson for all others. Another slave, Robin, was hung in chains until he died of starvation. And a third, Klaus, died while spread-eagled on the wheel, while his bones were smashed with a crowbar one by one. This is another way of reaching the public, appealing to the public. It would happen in the Battery, in the area where, in fact, people were to assemble for public display. So next time you sit there and have your lunch, think of what it looked like at another moment in time. We'll come back to this moment. Gotham summarizes this by saying the official response to the 1712 uprising initiates, as the authors describe it, a new era of routinized brutality and official cynicism toward slaves. And I think they have it right. Events from the early 1740s would then demonstrate that brutality as among the most infamous days in New York City's history. Days perhaps only matched by events in 1863, which we'll get to in about 3 or 4 weeks. A fire erupted in New York City's Fort George, the city's major military installation, on St. Patrick's Day of 1741. Remember that, St. Patrick's Day. Who would be celebrating in St. Patrick's Day? The Irish. I'll keep that. Who, on the whole, aren't quite black. It wasn't clear to the English how they treated the Irish, who they generally often treated as if they were black, but therefore they are others. Okay? St. Patrick's Day was a day for the Irish of remembering the abolition of slavery in Ireland. So in its own way, it was a day about slavery. It was a day in which the Irish remembered overthrowing their English lords and masters. And the Irish would be rebelling against the English, as you well know, for the next 100 and 200 years after that. The fire was set, it's believed, by an Irish arsonist simply called in the story Quack. Quack. The March winds, however, carried the fire. Carried it the next day to the governor's mansion, to the Church of English Chapel, to the military barracks, and to the wooden houses outside the fort's walls. Because again, remember that one of the things that New York had more than anything else was wood. And it made it easy to build houses, but it meant that the city was a tinderbox. Okay? And one of the things that people needed, New York also had something else. It's called winter. And in winter, one needs fire to keep warm. That is a combustible set of circumstances. And that's what happens in this case, though the actual chronology of events is often, again, hard to trace. The March winds, as I said, carried the fire. It was the first of 13 fires to terrorize the 11,000 citizens in the next weeks. Fears increasingly grow. Now, fire was common in the 18th century city, as was all these words of slave uprisings had been common. Remember, everybody in 1741, they were only 30 years from 1711. That's basically a generation and a half. So somebody who was 20 in 1711 is 50 in 1741. They were nursed on those fears. Okay? They cut their teeth on those earlier stories and remained anxious about them. Word of slave uprisings and of slaves trying to burn Charleston in 1737 and in 1740 also had reached the city. So when Coffey, a slave owned by Adolph Phillips, again that Phillips family, was seen leaving the premises of the 10th fire, a cry went up that the Negroes are rioting. The Negroes are rising. So there had been this early fire from St. Patrick's Day, a lot more afterwards. Now, a black is seen leaving the fire. We don't know what it means to yell fire in a crowded theater. We've all heard that concern. Well, here's what happens when this fire cry goes out. The city council investigation finds, in fact, no evidence. So the case is turned over to city recorders and the justice of the Supreme Court, a man by the name of David Horsmond, and you don't have to know him particularly. It's turned over to another authority. He, however, was someone who had long believed that people had been too lenient towards slaves and that their policy had encouraged insubordination. That's to say, he was, we might call him simply a profoundly conservative, anxious person who believed that the slaves had been encouraged to be insubordinate by liberal policies or something like that. That's what it might sound like. Okay? That people had not been tough enough in teaching them, giving them a sense of rules, restrictions, appropriate behavior. He starts a vast dragnet. And dragnet brings in several hundred whites and black suspects who are snared, investigated, and many of them are tried. He finds in particular a white tavern keeper by the name of John Hewson, who is selling liquor to blacks, and equally worrisome, had a lot of smuggled goods on his land and therefore wasn't paying taxes, to be particularly dangerous, and tries him as well. The tavern, however, was also a more complicated racialized space. It was known publicly as a place that housed a woman called Negro Peg, who was described and thought to be a notorious prostitute. Remember how I've already tried to suggest complicated attitudes about gender and sexuality that made people anxious. It isn't clear that we even knew what prostitution was during that period. If you were rich, it was simply meant that you were sleeping with somebody else. If you were poor, it was presumed it was prostitution. So when laws were passed about prostitution in the 19th century, they focused on what was called common prostitutes, sailors' women, rather than officers' women. Okay? So there were always these kinds of class perspectives and little understanding that in many cases women had in relationships with sailors who were out at sea, and then the sailor was coming back, or that they were in multiple relationships, or it was the only way to make a decent living. What was the warmest place in the city? If you wanted warmth in a city, where was there a fire? Always. Not necessarily in your home, but always in a tavern. Okay? Taverns were male spaces. Any woman who went into a tavern was thought to be a woman of low morality, i.e. a prostitute. So you need again to have a sense of the complicated physical spaces of social relationships in the city and how it creates narratives that fuel popular imaginations and fears. This notorious prostitute was in fact a young, nubile woman named Margaret Kelly, also known as the Newfoundland Irish Beauty. Oh, we're back to Ireland. You see this complicated set of identities. So is she Irish or is she black? Or maybe she's both, or who knows, or she's whatever scares you most. Whatever fuels your imagination. She had had a child by the name of Caesar. That was the source of a lot of gossip around town. A child born out of wedlock. The father was somebody by the name of John Gwynn, Gwin, who was rumored to be a soldier back at the old fort, who many people thought was suspicious. Remember those Irish people who were opposed to the English. And even though the baby was white, and I haven't seen the baby, so I don't know how white it was or not. I know you all think I was that old, that I was around then, but I wasn't. Others insisted that it was black. Gwyn was a regular at Hewson's Tavern and was in fact he was not Irish, he was in fact an African slave who had brought goods to Hewson Defense. So he was involved in the smuggling trade. He was a soldier. He was involved with this woman. This woman had an illegitimate child. There were all kinds of things that made this person disrespected, unruly, okay? Undeserving poor, vulnerable. The dragnet conducted by Horsmanden resulted in charges against Peg and Hewson of conspiring, confederating, and I'm quoting, conspiring, confederating, and combining with diverse Negroes and others to burn the city of New York and also to kill the inhabitants thereof. That was his conclusion.
Can you repeat his name?
Yeah, of Horsmanden, Horsman, like the word man, Den. Horsmanden. So he decides it was a conspiracy of blacks with some unruly Irish and whites, that had been organized by soldiers, sailors, and slaves from Ireland, the Caribbean, and Africa, who this official called, and I quote again, thinking about otherness in the society, called, quote, the outcasts of the nations of the earth. So it's a rebellion, the outcasts of the nations of the earth. In May of 1741, Hewson was suspended in chains and hung in public next to the rotting corpses of Caesar, a slave. His body was hung for 3 weeks in public at the Battery, as throngs of spectators watched until his body burst, putrid. It was meant to create awe, fear, respect. The prosecution continued to find everyone else in the conspiracy. And people started naming names of everyone they met at the tavern, of trials, of hangings. By the end, 160 blacks and 21 whites were arrested. 4 whites were hung, including Hewson, with his wife Sarah and Peggy. 17 blacks were hung. 13 additional blacks were burned, all in public. And 72 blacks were evicted from the colony. The trials and the hangings only ended when the noose got close to authority. When people started naming people in authority, then they began to think that these charges were going out of control. And so the trials were brought to a close only when prosecutors decided that things had gotten out of hand and their own names risked being called. The trials themselves threatened to become a source of disorder, that's to say. So what do we make of all this and what actually happened? We know some things. Historians disagree. We know Gotham argues there's little evidence of a conspiracy, but lots of hatred. They see it, in that sense, as a story of kind of witchcraft and white paranoia rather than as a riot. Not as social protest by poor people and outcasts. I think that recent evidence since Gotham was written suggests otherwise. And I will put forward at least their argument. It's written by 2 historians named Peter Linebaum and Marcus Rediker in a book called The Many-Headed Hydra: Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic. That's their book, published a year after Gotham was published. Their evidence is that the conspiracy was real. That's to say, it was social political protest. It was not a conspiracy. It was an active of rebellion. It was revolutionary action by the oppressed, by the outcast nations of the earth against what they saw as their oppressors. In that sense, nonetheless, it met with, we could argue, unspeakable brutality by the authorities. But the authorities were not in that sense necessarily wrong, that these people were out against them. There's some evidence that they were. Linebaum and Rediker offer the following, and I'll conclude with, give you a sense of their argument. First of all, the context of the time. The ruling class was divided and squabbling. There was a hard winter with a lot of misery, and everybody was incredibly anxious and upset, especially the poorest, that were desperate to get by and not being helped by the rich. There was a war with Spain, and it had seen 600 of the fort's soldiers shipped out to fight. And the soldiers were all anxious that they were going to be sent out to fight and die in a war against Spain. There was at that moment in the 30s, a great awakening of Protestant revivalism. And we know that those kinds of moments of spiritual awakenings often gave vent to notions about egalitarianism and opposition to slavery. A notion that reform of society had to be made now, and that everyone could be an agent of that reform, that the kingdom of God could be made on earth now, not in the hereafter. and it armed common people to believe that they could be doing God's work by taking the law into their own hands as an act of justice. It was a powerful message. There were other contexts. The memory of 1711, 1712, vivid among established settlers, fueled by vivid images that there were rebellions in the Caribbean just before this. And third, if we have the context, we have memory. The third is the convergence of revolutionary groups in New York City, of these people on the margins with long grievances and traditions of rebellion. And who are they? First, African tribes. Blacks had come from Africa. They had come with baggage. It included tribal traditions of rebellion. Circles of headsmen met with ties to specific African communities in New York. They repeatedly took war oaths, supposedly, common to those they had taken in West Africa, and that had been used in the 1712 rebellion. So there's some suggestion that we need to understand that African slaves were not just passive vessels, that they could be active agents of their own life with their own traditions, much as the Irish had traditions of rebellion in Ireland that they would import here. Secondly, Spanish rebels. Leading Spanish-American figures were described in the media as Negroes and mulattoes. That's to say, the Spanish were swarthy and were sometimes imagined as black folks and treated that way. They had been taken captive in the West Indies, and they had been brought on a vessel to New York City in 1740, where they were being sold as slaves in New York City harbor. They insisted that they were subjects of the Spanish king. They had serious objections to their status in New York. And these men, it was noted, were particularly skilled in what were known as fireballs. That's to say, the use of incendiary substances using fire as weapons. And the third group were the Irish. 30 to 35 rebels were Irish soldiers at the fort. And we don't know a whole lot about them, but we know that there is a logic to them too. They hated the Protestant English from Ireland. From their Irish experience, they despised the army. And many had been deported from Ireland as felons under what were probably quasi-political circumstances, in which they were, in their own way, had been politically incarcerated in New York City. So they had grounds for rebellion as well. Those are the convergent forces that may well have come together. And one last group, Caribbean rebels. The people who had been being rebels in England and Caribbean were on those boats that were coming to New York City harbor. And many came to New York. So what we have are competing narratives. One suggests conspiracy. The other suggests that it was a freedom struggle by revolutionary resistors. The authorities, men in ruffles, men in fancy coats and ties, respond by closing the taverns, by criminalizing black and white relationships. The merchants respond by restructuring the black trade so that they no longer go to the Caribbean, but rather deal directly with Africa, so they can avoid having any of these rebels come from the Caribbean. So there's evidence that the merchants understood this problem as insurrection. And the last response was the creation in New York of a hardened white identity designed to cut across different ethnicities. Now authorities would demonize anyone, even of European descent, as black if they support the rebels. So Houston is described by the rebels as, quote, blacker than a Negro, the white tavern keeper, blacker than a Negro, in support of this. How does one conclude? Well, the brutality and lessons about the price of race relations in New York City would be high. But against the Zenger affair, in its story of faction, as a product of freedom of the press, there is another lesson. Faction is not simply a story of competing elites. It's also a story of class conflict that is highly racialized, against which all elites could unite and did unite against these others, against otherness. John Locke would teach them to value life, liberty, and property, animated by fears from below. But the New York elite representatives would help press for a constitution that would enshrine as rights principles on which New York City would develop as a global center for capitalism: life, liberty, and the pursuit of furs, codfish, rum, molasses, real estate, slaves, and in time, whale blubber for oil. And when that ran out, happiness. See you next time.